Okay, so now that we've talked about these box definitions, let's make our own graph. I'm just going to go to File and New. All right. So what's nice is that you can open and close Grasshopper files in Grasshopper with the File pull-down menu. You also want to make sure you save them. They're independent files from the Rhino files. And so they have a .gh extension if you're looking at them in your file explorer. So let's start off by finding that box widget. And so I just happen to know this, but if you look at these tabs, there's parameters, math, sets, vector, curve, surface, mesh, etc. I might have a few extras that you don't have. Every time you install a plugin that has its own separate tools, it creates another tab for that. And so we'll talk about some of these, Kangaroo and Lunchbox, later on in the semester. But don't worry about those if you don't see them on your interface. I just happen to know we're going to be making a box that's a poly surface. I'm going to say surface and primitives. And here there's several different ways to make a box, from 2 points, from a bounding box with a rectangle. Here we go, from the center point. I think that's what we were using. And I'll go ahead and click it, and then it'll let me click on my graph and place the widget here. Okay, so when I hold my cursor over these things, you can start to see the label. Center box, create a box centered on a plane. I believe you can change the labels on these widgets. So if yours actually has a set of words written sort of sideways along this, let me see. If I go to View, pull down menu, or maybe Display, draw icons, draw full names. No, here we go. I'm going to turn that off for a second. Let's see, draw icons. There we go. So if I turn draw icons off in my display pull down, then it says, oh, box, right? Instead of using the icon. I'll go ahead and turn it back to icons, just in case you're confused and you're like, oh, mine doesn't look like yours, Josh. That might be why. And anyway, so let's take a look at this widget. Like I said, it needs inputs, right? So it needs a couple of ingredients and parameters. It needs a base plane, right? And that's going to be the location, the center point, right? For this box. And then, of course, the size in X, the size in Y, and the size in Z. And if we provide all of those, it gives us a box. Now, this one's already given us a box. We haven't even plugged any values in. I think by default, when you put this box widget in, it's going to have some default inputs. So if I hold my cursor over this, first input B, right, it says, okay, you can plug in a base plane. And, as default, we'll just use the world XY plane for the base plane. And for X, you can plug in a value. But by default, we'll just set it to 1, and I believe 1 and 1. So we have a 1 by 1 by 1 cube situated on the 0, 0, 0 point in the world Cartesian coordinate system. So as you can see here, so as we start to make changes in Grasshopper, right, you can see the geometry, the actual geometry changing and appearing in Rhino in real time. Okay. So let's talk about, I'll leave the base plane as XY for now. Okay. Let's go ahead and, this is one of the simplest things we can do. And so it'd be good to start here, and that way we all know where our number sliders are. One quick way to make a sort of variable number, right? One that you can adjust the number slider to adjust the value. And so if I go to params tab, right, that's short for parameters. We talked about that the other day in class, what parameters are. I just happen to know what the icon looks like. It looks like a little timeline or a number line with an arrow pointed somewhere along it, right? That's called number slider. Now, if you can't remember exactly where something is, but you remember what it's called, like number slider, if I just double click anywhere in my canvas in Grasshopper, it brings up a search field. And so I can start typing in number, right? And there's like so many things you can do with numbers in here, right? I can just create one number that's not, is not connected to a number slider. But here's number slider, so I'll go ahead and place that. Okay. All right, let's take a look at this number slider widget. All right. I know this seems a little slow to you, but it's so important because you're going to be using number sliders now for the rest of your life. I'm going to double click on the label here that says slider. Okay, if I double click here in the actual number line, I can actually adjust the value of the slider. Okay, but if I select the label and double click, then it brings up a box and I can adjust the properties of the slider. Okay, let's take a look at these properties. I'm going to skip this for just a second and talk about this, the numeric domain. In other words, you can set the minimum value of the slider and the maximum value of the slider. Okay, it's very important. So if I select, double click on this and enter in -1 as the minimum value, right? Now you can see I can actually adjust the value into the negative or the positive side of 0. Okay, and of course I can change the maximum. Let's change it to 10, and just show you, right? Okay, I'll hit OK. Now you can see our number slider adjusts, and I can go all the way to -1 as the minimum and 10 as the maximum. Okay, let's go ahead and double click again on the slider label, bring up that box again. We can also be more specific about the values that this thing generates. Okay, so right now by default, you get the set of all real numbers, floating point. Basically what that means is you get all of the possible decimal values between your minimum and maximum. In this case, by default, it's up to 3 decimal places. I think we can change that somewhere. Yeah, probably right here, actually. Yeah, we can change the number of decimal places. For all practical purposes in architecture, 3 is more than you ever need, probably. Although I guess, well, I mean, 0.0625, that's 16. Maybe there's always a chance you could adjust those and give yourself some more decimal values if you need them. If you just want integers, right, like whole numbers, and the whole number sets in the negative range as well, right, then you can click N, and that turns the output to an integer. Or you can constrain this to just give you evens and odds between the minimum and maximum, right? So if I turn to evens, suddenly my outputs are -2, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And of course, odds would, just give you the odd sets. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and leave that at real numbers and just use all the numbers and hit OK. All right, I'll plug that in for X. Okay, what happens if I plug this in for all of them at the same time, right? This is going to govern both X, Y, and Z. I'll just always maintain a cube, right? Because all of these will have the exact same value, X, Y, and Z, because they're all being governed by just this one slider. Okay. So I've just dragged and dropped from this to this, right? And, why don't I make several sliders like we did in the last example? So we'll make one for Y, and we'll make one for Z. Okay. And I'll plug this one. Now if I just go ahead and plug a different slider in for Y, look at that, it replaces what was plugged in before with the new input, right? And I can do the same thing for Z as well, right? All right, let's practice. I'll double click on that label and change the minimum and maximum again. I'll leave the minimum at 0, the maximum at 10, and I'll change this maximum as well to 10. Just give me a little more space to play around the dimensions here. Right? There's the Z, there's the Y, there's the X. Okay, and remember the base plane is still just the default XY base plane. All right, so it's giving us a box, and if we were going to do something fun with this box, like put windows in it, or do something like that, then this is where the box comes out. We would plug that into let's say the make window tool or something like that. There's no such thing, of course, but we'll talk about these things later as we start to chain more and more things together. Really quickly, let's talk about some of the things that I was doing with numbers, just basic arithmetic. If I go to the Math tab, okay, there's a lot of different things here, but what we'll talk about now maybe are some of the operators, so addition, multiplication, division, subtraction, squaring things, factorials. There's a little bit of Boolean logic here, ifs, ands, nors, ands, buts, those sorts of things. But suffice to say, if you just want to do some simple arithmetic, here it is. So let's see here, right? Maybe do some addition. We'll make these things kind of weird. Okay, so I'm going to add A and B together, and I'll use that for B, just like we did before. So what's interesting is, right, this is going to add 2 numbers. Here's the first number to add, the second number to add, and then the result, the sum. Okay, and so if we use that sum and plug that in for Y, right, then we get x plus, or a plus b equals y. Right? In the last example, we did some division, right? So what's interesting is, as you probably understand from fractions, right? We're dividing a by b, right? And so in this case, let's say this input by this input. I'm going to relabel this since it wants to change the number or the label, which is pretty unfortunate. Let's see. It gets a little confusing. All right, so I'll change this to C. All right, so a plus b divided by c equals our z value, which seems kind of confusing. You got to keep this straight. But basically, since we're dividing something by b, or sorry, I keep saying that this input is just by default labeled b, but this number, right? As the number gets bigger, the result actually gets smaller, and vice versa, right? So if we use that for z, then we have that inverse relationship again. And of course, we have, we could always create like an exponential relationship as well, right? So we could always say, let's take this to this power. Ooh, it's going to be really large, right? And we'll use that as z. No, it's going to get really large. And so, as we can see, as this number slowly increases, the value for z gets, exponentially larger. Right? So we just gone from 0.5 to 1, and it's like more than doubled in size. And on and on and on. Okay, so I don't necessarily think you need to make boxes on your own. I just wanted to do this really quickly to sort of show you, what we're doing, dragging and dropping, connecting things up. If you connect something up in the wrong place, usually Grasshopper lets you know. If you see a widget that turns red, that means it's not able to complete the input. Sometimes a widget will turn orange, and sometimes it's still working, and sometimes it's not. That means that it doesn't have quite enough information, but it's trying its best guess. So if you encounter that, or if you plug something in the wrong place and you just need to unconnect it, right? You don't drag and drop. You can right-click on that input. I just right-clicked and say disconnect. You can disconnect that bad boy. There we go. All right. Okay, so now we've done that, let's actually do something kind of more fun and more productive. All right, in the next videos, we'll start talking about lines, curves, points, and then we'll start to build some interesting things pretty quickly. Grid systems that'll look like columns and structural frame. Then we'll go with trusses, and then we'll go with some space frame stuff. I can't wait.